Yeah, so take it away,
Okay.
Sarah. Thank you for being here.
Party time, yeah. Yeah, thank you all for joining us today. So my name is Sarah Quino, and I am a therapist on the north side in kind of Ravenswood area. And my specialties are really addiction, shame, and trauma. And today we're gonna talk about you guys, because I'm not a specialist for kids, so you're not here to learn anything about how to parent your children, but we're gonna really talk about how to take care of yourself and how to parent yourself, really, so that you are able to be the best version of yourself for your kids. So this is what we're going to do today. And since there's such a small group, I think we'll be able to really do like question and answer. And so if there are things that come up as I'm talking, just stop me and we can talk about it. And we're going to be doing a lot of experiential exercises today as well. So we're going to explore emotions and vulnerability, and shame resilience, and then antidotes to shame, which are empathy and self-compassion. So heal thyself, healthy self, right? I do actually work with a lot of parents, and one of the struggles that I hear for folks is whenever I'm saying something to them, they hear it through the lens of, oh, I've got to be able to teach this to my children. So it might be a real challenge for you to kind of shift that way of thinking today and really apply all these things to yourself. Because, you know, one of the biggest questions I often get is, how do I teach my kids, let's say, self-esteem, right? How do I get my kids to have good self-esteem? Well, it's really more about what you do and less about what you say. So if you are finding a way to work on your self-esteem or your self-compassion and the way that you feel about yourself, that is going to translate to your children. So, what are emotions? I'm curious before I tell you what I think. What do you think?
Feelings?
They are feelings, yep. But what are they? They come out of nowhere? Come out of nowhere? What else? Right, of course it depends on what's going on in your life. But what are they? Right? We don't think about that very often. It's the stuff that comes up every single day, out of nowhere, right? But we don't really talk about what they are. And I think it's so important for us to know as adults, how do I know what my feelings are in order to help teach my children, right? So, what are emotions? An emotion is the way our brain gives meaning to bodily sensation based on experiences. How does that land with you? Make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Right? So the thing that I hear about emotions sometimes is, well, like, I'm not in control of my emotions, and it's just this thing that happens. It comes out of nowhere, but it's really about, there's two parts to it essentially. There's our physiological sensations that happen, and then our brain takes a survey of what's going on around us, and the brain says, well, this is bad based on what the situation is, or this is good, or this is neutral, right? And so we might not have control over the physiological.
No more?
No more.
Okay.
No more. Sorry about that.
No,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Sure. Yeah, but please feel free to take pictures of
Is it
everything.
handout or?
Yeah.
Oh, that's fine.
Sorry, guys.
So the physiological sensations that happen, we might not have control over what actually happens in the body, but we do have some choices about the stories that we tell ourselves. Would you agree with that? Yeah. Are you relating? Anything you want to share around that?
I was just explaining that to my son
Yeah.
about me, and I was telling him sometimes when I make decisions based on my emotions. So sometimes you
Right.
can't trust it when you've been hurt in some form. You don't speak from that space.
Right.
It's not always.
Right. So the thing that I tell my clients is feelings are not facts, right? So it's this very nuanced here. So feelings are real, but they're not facts. You see how that's different? Because whatever you're feeling at whatever given time is always right. Nobody can ever tell you, don't feel that feeling, because it's how you're feeling. It's the behavior that can be in question, right? So if I'm angry, the choices that I have are I could lash out. You know, my husband is the one who gets the brunt of my frustration and anger, right? So if I'm angry at him, I could lash out. I could say some really awful stuff to him. Or I could recognize I'm having an emotion based on what's happening and make a choice about the way that I want to behave based on that. Right? Does that resonate with folks? Yeah. And so what I wanted to talk about is ways to start recognizing our emotions a little bit more often. So I found this from, there's a little website down here, so if you want to take a picture of this, you can read the full article. But I thought this was a really great list of things that you can do to begin to recognize your emotions. So first of all, examine your physical sensations. So maybe we can do an exercise with this right now. I know a lot of folks are eating, but if you feel like joining in with this, please join me. So if you close your eyes, because sometimes it can be easier to go inward when you close your eyes, so that's an invitation, but you don't have to. But if you close your eyes and just notice what's happening in your body. Our culture doesn't often ask us to slow down and notice what's happening inside. And if anybody wants to kind of just shout out, what are you feeling? What are you noticing? Nothing?
Like a little scared feeling or something inside.
Okay, yeah. Was it here? You were
Yes.
gesturing to your stomach? Yeah. So a little scared feeling. How do you know it's scared? What tells you that it's fear?
Like, we say it's butterflies.
Butterflies. So this is a great example. So butterflies in the stomach. Who's ever been on a roller coaster? You get butterflies in your stomach when you're on a roller coaster? Now, is that a bad feeling? No. If we like roller coasters, we're into that, right? And yet, we can have butterflies in our stomach when there's something that we consider bad, right? So that's a really good example of the sensation doesn't necessarily tell us whether it's good or bad, but it's information, right? So I'd be curious, and you don't have to go into the details, but I'd be curious for you why that sensation goes straight to, like, it's fear, it's scary, right? Anybody else notice some physical sensations? Tense where? In your shoulders. Right. Is there a story that you make up with that too?
No, it's just sometimes I have to make myself conscious and aware that I'm sort of, and I just have to like, okay.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. It's funny how we have these bodies and we just kind of like walk around like they're not even really part of our heads, and we do have to stop and really think. This is one of my favorite things to do. So I have to be very conscious of letting go of my shoulders. Any other physical sensations?
Well, sweating, like perspire.
Yeah.
Especially when you're nervous.
Sure. Yeah. So perspiration and sweating, and that can be information too about a whole host of things. It can literally be, it's just too hot, which that's not the case in this room. It's a little chilly. But it can also be nerves. It can be a whole host of things, right? And what story do you make up when you start sweating?
What story do I make up?
Yeah, what story goes on in your head? Like, I'm sweating. What do you make of that?
Make a presentation or something for people or a crowd. Do you think it's perspective?
So is that fear that comes up? Yeah, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean fear, right? Because when you're speaking in front of a group of people, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah, great. So examine our physical sensations and then identify the emotion or feeling that comes with that. So let's take anger, because I think that's like the sensations that come with anger tend to be pretty pronounced, right? So let's say you get, I don't know, you're in line at the grocery store and somebody starts to like butt in and cut in front of you, right? So we might get angry about that, but what physical sensations are going to go along with that? What happens for you physically when you become angry?
Heart start racing.
Your heart racing? What else?
Face starts showing. Yeah.
What happens in your face?
It started.
So you are going to show your displeasure,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What else?
Raise your voice.
You might raise your voice. Yeah. What else physically though? Yeah.
Stress comes, your shoulders back up.
Right. Our shoulders go up for sure. How about fists? Like sometimes we might be clenching our jaw, right? So identifying the physical sensations and then identifying the emotion or feeling, this is creating mindfulness, right? So that we're just aware of what's happening. And as I said before, when we're experiencing an emotion, if somebody cuts in line in the grocery aisle, you've got choices, right? You can yell and scream and rant and rave, and holler and make a big old mess, right? You could because maybe the person didn't know, and you can kind of be like, hey, I was in line next, right? You could say something like that, or you could say nothing at all. And probably the most aggressive choice would be to attack the person, right? And that one might not end well for anyone involved. But the other ones, it doesn't matter, right? There's not necessarily a complete right and wrong in any situation, but my curiosity would be, if you didn't say anything, whether you would be pissed off for the rest of the day, right? And how often do we disregard our own emotions in order to just be okay, avoid conflict, or have things just be copacetic, right? It's something to think about, not only in settings with other people, but especially with families, right? Because like I said, my poor husband gets the brunt of my anger most because it's a safe relationship, and I know I'm allowed to be angry in that, but it doesn't mean he deserves it, right? So notice any judgment and let it go. So I talk a lot about mindfulness and self-compassion and ways that we can care for ourselves, and often I'll hear people say things like, well, I really want to not be judgmental. Well, guess what? That's not really a thing that we can do as humans, because part of what our brain does is put things in order and judge them in order to figure out what's safe and what's not safe. So the goal is not to be free from judgment, because I don't think I've met a human that's reached that yet, but we want to be able to recognize that we have that judgment and potentially let it go or soften it. I always try to invite a softening instead of trying to reject it, because it's a part of us, right? So if this person cuts in line in front of you at the grocery store, you notice your physical sensations, right? You notice that, and then you name the feeling. Okay, I'm feeling angry, and then thinking about, okay, what judgments am I making up? What might we be saying about that person who cut us off?
They're
Rude,
disrespectful.
disrespectful.
To pay back.
What is it?
Want to pay back.
You want a revenge, right? What else?
Yes. Bad words.
Yeah.
What, right? Bad words. What else? That's enough, right? Right? So
To the bad words. Yeah.
right, we might be making up all these stories about this person, but maybe they've got a sick kid at home, and they really gotta get this kid some chicken soup or whatever the hell they're buying at the store, right? Maybe, like I said earlier, maybe they didn't really notice. Maybe there's so many people in the grocery store, it's kind of hard to figure out who's next in line, right? And when we personalize that story and make it all about we are being wronged, we don't really have all the information. And so that's why it's really, really good to invite some curiosity and see if we can soften that judgment, right? Because I always like to think about when I get in a space of judgment or anger, or feeling like I'm being wronged in some way, I really try to think about what's the payoff for me to be angry, right? So if this guy cuts me off and I'm just like, keeping all this anger inside, what do I get out of that?
High blood pressure.
High blood pressure, exactly, right? And do I need that?
No.
Right? And I do want to say too that everything that I'm sharing today is way easier said than done. Everything that I'm sharing with you is a practice, and so I don't expect that at the end of today you're just going to be like, everything's great and I'm never going to be mad at anybody again. It's not about that. It's just in kind of being mindful and inviting some different ways of relating to this. So another one to recognize our emotions is be still. How often do we give ourselves space to really think about what it is that we're feeling? Does anybody have a meditation practice or any alone time practices? I mean, when you have kids, I can only imagine that it's really, really hard to be alone, period, right? Like the bathroom, I hear, is for most of my parents that I work with, that's the only time to be alone, right? Right. I would encourage, if there's any way for you to cultivate some stillness for yourself, and also invite your kids to do it with you, right? It looks like here, I was looking outside of the library coming in, it looks like they have, instead of detention or timeout, they have like a little meditative area for kids to kind of calm and settle their systems. Well, adults need that too, right? So if you can find any amount of time, even if you just sit in the bathroom for an extra 5 minutes, whatever it is, if you can cultivate that for yourself and let that be a time when you're going to check in with, how am I feeling right now? How was I feeling at other times during this week or today, right? Right. Does anybody journal? Yeah, some people journal.
Yes.
And how does that work for you? What do you find when you journal?
It's therapeutic.
Yeah, it's very therapeutic. Yeah, anybody else?
I calm down if I'm
Yes.
really, it's like high string, it calms me down.
Yes.
As I write, I feel myself coming down.
Because it's not inside you anymore, right? It's outside of
Coming out,
you.
yeah.
Yes.
With me, I don't write, I just listen to music.
Well, you're skipping ahead.
Okay.
Wait for it.
Okay.
Right? But writing, if it gets out of your head, there's something about, going to see a therapist and talking about your problems,
Yes.
writing your problems on a piece of paper. There are exercises that I do with my clients, and I've done personally, where I write a letter that's never going to be sent, right? Person doesn't even have to be alive anymore. I write that letter just to get it outside of me and move that energy. So that can be a helpful way to, because you can also look at what you wrote and be like, oh, okay, anger, fear, sad, right? You can kind of take stock of what you're feeling there. Talk to someone. I always recommend therapy. But even if you can't see a therapist or there's nobody available, just talking to a friend, somebody who has earned the right to hear your stories. Can we maybe let in our new folks? Make sure to grab some lunch too if you're hungry.
Okay.
And if you want to go around here,
Yeah, I'll go around.
get the seats in the front. Yeah. Great. And then we have listen to music. Tell me what music you like to listen to.
I usually, depending on what mood swing I'm in, I usually listen to gospel or
Oh, yeah.
R&B,
Nice.
something like Rihanna or something like that.
Oh, yes. Riri. My girl. That's awesome. Well, the thing about music, so there's something about the actual music that we're hearing or the voice that we're hearing that's very soothing to the system or energizes us, right? But also, if you're really listening to the lyrics, sometimes music can be empathy. Who
Yeah.
listens to sad music when you're sad? Right? And when you're like I don't know about you, but when I've had my heart broken and I'm crying along with it, I'm like, they understand me, right? Right? It's a connection, even though you're not having that, you're not speaking with that person. This is why when musicians die, I swear to God, when Prince died, I was giving a presentation and someone told me in the middle of the presentation, and I was like, I do not know if I can go on. I don't know him, but his music was so moving and so important to me because I feel like there's some sort of connection there, right? Because when you listen to the lyrics and you're so moved by somebody who's so talented. So music is great. And then practicing of daily reflection. So does anybody have a practice where you think through your day? Yeah, what do you do for yourself? What does that look like?
It's like Ignatian spirituality. So yeah, you walk through your day, beginning of the day,
Mhm.
you pause and think about things you did,
Yeah.
or said, or you're sorry about.
Yeah, wonderful, right, yes. Anybody else?
Well, I have to write down every single thing I'm gonna do in that day. So
Yeah.
if I don't have daily goals, I feel like I'm not doing it.
Well, so I'm going to challenge this a little bit because that sounds like, and I relate to this too, kind of an anxiety-driven need to accomplish rather than reflection on what you're feeling and where you are internally, right? And there's nothing wrong with a to-do list. Please, I love a to-do list, and I'm someone who tends to, I guess, measure my worth by the amount that I get accomplished, which is something I'm trying to soften it, but it's so hard, right? But I wonder if you could do that to-do list and add, and how was I feeling when I accomplished this, right? Or how did I feel when I didn't accomplish this?
Yeah.
Which might be even more important. Yeah.
I think it's cliche, but I find it very true. You should give yourself a little leeway. Sometimes you might find yourself a single parent driving children back and forth, back and forth from homework, then having a career that's very aggressive,
Right.
be nice to yourself.
Yes.
If you look at your budget and you can't figure out why you don't have extra money, well, you've got your kids and extracurricular activities. You got
Mhm.
buying this for your kid, you're buying that for your kid, and that's perfectly right. Give yourself not credit, but leeway.
Compassion.
Give yourself some compassion. Thank you.
And friend, we are gonna get there.
That's right.
Yes, that is a big piece of this. Yeah, did you wanna share?
Yeah, so my reflection actually, I try to do it I do it in the morning, but then I try to do it at night as well. But it starts in the morning. Like when I drop my children off at school or at the bus stop, I typically have about 45 minutes before I have to start work.
Nice.
And going to Pete's grocery store is so therapeutic for me.
I love it.
I love Pete's.
Therapeutic
So
grocery shopping. I'm into it.
So I go to Pete's and I'll just sit in the parking lot for like a half hour in prayer and meditation, and even just in observance of like the people that are rushing to get to the train or running in and out to get to the store, or children that are cutting through the schoolyard, through the parking lot to get to school on time. So even just starting the day, having enough time to be calm and not rushing, parking and jumping out the car, just sitting for about half hour before I even move, it helps so much.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you carved that time out for yourself. That's great. Yeah. Did you want to share?
Yeah, a little bit. Like, my reflection is like every morning.
Yeah.
I drive sometimes taxi and Uber. Ask myself that, okay, this morning I'm alive. How many people went to bed last night? Couldn't wake up this morning?
Yeah. So I hear that as gratitude.
Yeah. So
right? You're saying thank you for this
that pushes me
day.
every morning, like, give thanks or praises to God that, okay, I'm alive this morning.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you. So I wanted to show this as well. So this picture shows you the heat and the cool that comes with different emotions. Because as we're talking about physical heat, you're like, yes. If you even Google, I think it's emotions heat map or something like that, this comes up. But so if you look at all of these different emotions, can you like think about what those emotions feel like and be like, oh yeah, I guess I do get hot in my head when I feel pride. And another thing I wanted to point out, so look at shame and surprise. We've got a little Spider-Man action going on here, but those are pretty much the same, aren't they? And we consider surprise usually to be a quote-unquote good emotion, whereas we feel shame is a quote-unquote bad emotion, but the physical sensation is the same, right? So that's just another thing to think about when we're thinking about what is the story that I'm making up based on the physical sensations and then what's happening around me, right? So now we're gonna do a fun little exercise. So maybe get in groups of like 3 or 4 with people who are around you, and what I'm gonna ask you to do is choose an emotion. Don't say it out loud, but I want you to choose an emotion in your head and then act it out physically. So no talking with this whole exercise. You're going to act it out physically, and I want your group members to guess which emotion you are acting out. Okay? So we're going to do this for a few minutes, and we're going to talk about it and see what happens, okay? Okay.
Are we sharing with each other after?
Once they guess it, go ahead and share. Yep. But so we're just, it's kind of like charades, right? Okay. So get in your little groups and go for it.
It started, so I can see what okay, together? Or one for each or 3?
Sure, one for each. We'll just do it until people seem to be done.
Okay. What emotion are we sharing? Angry. Okay. Surprise. No. Because I'm not going to attack first. Okay.
acting skills.
Surprise?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. She's good. Yes. Discuss, yep. Angry?
No.
No?
They're not
Okay,
discussed.
we get it.
Oh, yeah, we did.
You're worried, but no, you're not worried.
Has everybody gotten a chance to go?
No.
Everybody got a chance? Okay.
You're trying to call me with.
All right, so let's discuss. So,
Jealous.
what did you notice in this exercise?
That the looks, that the looks showed, that most of these looks were visible. That we were able to kind of, while I don't think that we can always look at someone and know what's going on the inside, I guess maybe for the sake of this exercise, that we were able to know the feeling.
Did you always get it right on the first time? No. Isn't that interesting? But we walk around this world thinking we know how each other feels, right? Isn't that funny, right? Like your kids come home, they probably got a look on their face, like stank face, and you're like, why are you so angry? And they're like, I'm not angry, right? But we think this, and I particularly picked some of these emotions because they probably look the same, right? What were some of the wrong guesses that you had?
I had like fear.
Fear? What did you think fear was?
Well, I did discuss it, but I got fear and
Okay, so she picked disgust
And shame.
and shame, and these look the same, right? So it's so important to recognize that we might not always be able to just look at someone and tell how they're feeling. So sometimes we need to ask, right? And these are a couple of phrases that I came up with for things that we can say when we're trying to essentially figure out how somebody feels, right? So first one is, you seem to be feeling angry. Did I get that right? Like, is that actually what you're experiencing? You know, we want to ask because we don't want to just assume. And the next one, I can try to assume how you'd feel, but I'd rather you tell me how you're feeling right now, right? Because that's eliciting intimate communication instead of just assuming, which we love to do as humans. And then whenever I have someone who I know is experiencing a difficult emotion, this is my go-to. I can only imagine how you must be feeling right now. Because sometimes I don't really know, and I want to invite people to share that with me. Does anybody have a practice like this where you're really kind of checking out emotions either with your children or your partners or friends? No? But are you gonna? Right? But first we have to start with ourselves.
I think what was really helpful, one of my takeaways from the last presentation that you did, I'm not sure if it was you who specifically said it or if it was a part of what we watched, but just knowing sometimes that we don't necessarily have to be able to relate and use certain words to say that I understand, but to just be available.
Yes.
Or that last quote, I can only imagine how you must be feeling. Not always having to have the words to express,
Right.
I understand, or I've been there, or, you know, trying to have someone, in empathizing with people, sometimes I think we can put our foot in our mouth.
Right.
So sometimes just showing up in silence and being there says a lot.
Yeah.
It was the silver lining presentation that you did. I remember.
Yep. And we're going to talk more about that. Yay! So if you didn't get it, don't worry, you're not going to be left out. But yeah, we're going to talk a lot more about empathy moving forward in this. Awesome. So let's talk about vulnerability for a second. So is the term, and there's not a correct answer to this, but when you hear the word vulnerability, do you think that it's a good thing or a bad thing? What do you think?
I think I relate that to both. Good and bad.
Both. Yeah, I love that, right? I think culturally, we're taught that vulnerability is bad,
That is weak.
that it's weakness. But these are two separate things, right? So weakness essentially is faulty, flawed, defective, deficient, right? So if we think about, like, let's think of a chain, right? Like your bike chain or something like that, right? So a bike chain, if there's a weakness in the bike chain, it can break and fall apart and be defective, right? We think about vulnerability. Oh, you can't see what it says there, but vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. So when we think about vulnerability, there is a potential for us to experience harm. But that in and of itself, just like we were talking about emotions earlier, it's based on the story that we're making up, right? So if we're in a relationship with somebody that's really important, whether it be, you know, a friend or an intimate relationship, if there's vulnerability there, that person might be able to hurt us. And guess what? The bad news is that we can't have really good relationships without vulnerability. Has anybody tried that before, to like just keep everything from a person that they were trying to have a relationship with? Ever done that? It doesn't work. You only get so far in that relationship, and then it feels like there's something missing. There's a lack of depth of connection there, right? So we do have to be willing on some level to step into vulnerability. And one of the things Brené Brown always says is that we want to be vulnerable with people who have earned the right to hear our story, right? We don't need to share the intimate details of our life with every single person who's around. I like to think of it as kind of like concentric circles. So the people who are in my inner circle, it's my husband and it's my best friends, and that's it. And then there's kind of, you know, different levels of vulnerability for how much people have demonstrated their trustworthiness, right? And that's absolutely a healthy way to utilize vulnerability. So, okay, before I get to this next slide, I'm going to warn you that this may be a part of the presentation where you start to slip into being a parent again instead of being a human. Because every time I talk about this next stuff on the slide here, people are like, oh, I'm screwing up my kids. Well, guess what? Everyone's screwing up their kids, so you're not alone. But I want you to look at these next couple slides and think about your own experiences of when you were children, okay? Deal? Okay. So, there was a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and basically what happened was there was a doctor who was doing a study on weight loss, and there were hundreds of people in this study, and they were morbidly obese, and they were supposed to lose X amount of weight. And what ended up happening was a lot of the people would get to 5 to 10 pounds away from their ultimate goal, and then they would backslide and then maybe even gain all the weight back. And the doctor who set up this study was like, what is going on? Like, this doesn't make any sense. What is happening here? And what he found was the people who struggled to get to their goal and maintain their goal, all of them experienced these adverse childhood experiences. So what this is essentially 10 categories of things that may have happened to us as children that are considered traumatic, right? So these, everybody knows about these, right? Physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. That's kind of obvious, right? Everybody knows that that is trauma. But here too we have emotional neglect and physical neglect. What is emotional neglect?
Not paying attention.
Not paying attention, right? What else?
Not held enough or said nice words to you. Being ignored.
Yes, being ignored.
Being held.
Right, not being held.
Kissed.
Right. Did anybody grow up in a household where a parent may not have said, I love you? I did. That's emotional neglect, right? And this is not to say that, you know, our parents were terrible people. Our parents were doing the best they could, and sometimes it wasn't good enough. And that's an unfortunate reality, right? So, and then household dysfunction. So, mental illness. Did any of us grow up in a household where a parent had a mental illness that prevented them from really being the best version of themselves, right? Me too, right? Incarceration. Having somebody in the home who's incarcerated, that stresses the family in so many different ways, right? Mother treated violently. So if you witnessed your mother, and I'm guessing actually that it would also probably be father treated violently as well, because I've definitely worked with clients where the domestic violence has been from a female to a male as well. And then substance abuse, who came from a family where there was substance abuse in the home. Right. And then this one, we finally started to recognize that divorce is actually a very traumatic experience for children, right? And a lot of us have experienced that. So I'm feeling like as soon as I put this slide up, a little bit of the air went out of the room. How are you all feeling hearing these things?
I'm okay with it. The only thing that I can relate to is, and it wasn't my parents per se, but it was my mom's two brothers that was mentally ill.
Mm-hmm.
They lived in the same household
Yeah.
with us.
Yeah.
So I can relate to that.
Yeah, it doesn't just have to be your parents, but people who are close with you, who are in the home, who are affecting what happens inside your home. Absolutely. Yeah. Are we feeling okay, or is anybody getting stirred up by this content? You're doing okay? All right. Just keep checking in. Like, that's why I did the recognizing our physical sensations first, because I just want to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves through this. So then, as a result of experiencing one of those adverse childhood experiences, these are the things that can develop. So we can have both physical and mental health issues that show up. And I don't know about you, but this one showed up for me, and this one showed up for me, and what else is on here? Pretty much all of these showed up for my mother, experiencing her adverse childhood experiences. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Any of these, you don't have to raise your hand necessarily, but any of these look familiar to you based on what you experienced in your childhood. Yeah. And so that's why I really wanted to do this presentation, to have you focus on you. Because when we are living with these things, how good are we at passing on love and care to other people in our lives? It's a struggle, right? And so I want to give reverence to what everyone in this room has been through, and the fact that you're still not only standing, but you're thriving. You're thriving enough that you're able to come on a Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon and hang out with me, right? So bravo to everyone who's in this room right now. So now that we've talked about a little bit of the ugly feelings, let's talk about shame. Woo! So let's do a little exercise first. And let me see if I can. Okay. Let me mute this, because we're going to do, yes, great. And they have markers. Oh my God, it's my lucky day. So let's do the third one first. So if shame were a color, what color would it be?
Black.
Black? Red?
Dark blue.
Light blue? Dark blue. What else? We good with those colors? Okay. So how about if shame were a food? Yeah.
Cookies.
Cake. Cookies. Cake.
Ice cream.
Ice cream. Donuts.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Anything else? What did you say?
I said pork.
Pork.
Pork is good.
What is it?
An onion.
Onion. What else? Anything else? Okay. How about if shame were an animal? What would it be? A cat. Dog. Bird. Insect. What kind of insect?
Cockroach.
Cockroach.
Say a turtle.
What is it? A snake or a turtle? Mm-hmm. Anything else? Good with those? Okay. So how about list words that describe shame?
Embarrassed.
Embarrassed. Hurt.
Disappointment.
Disappointment.
Guilt.
Yeah.
I heard guilt.
Regret.
Unbelief.
Regret. What was another one?
Unbelief.
What is it?
Regret and unbelief.
Unbelief. Anything else? Good with that? Okay. So let me have y'all play therapist for a minute. In terms of why I asked if shame were a color, a food, or an animal, why do you think I asked that question? How does this help us understand shame?
To identify how it shows up.
Yeah. And what happens when we're talking about something other than emotion? This was pretty easy for you, right? Right? But if I asked you, explain shame to me, it can be a little bit harder. Because emotions, like we said earlier, it's kind of like, well, they just show up and I don't really know, and right? So to be able to put it outside of ourselves and make it something concrete can be a really helpful exercise. So let me just tell you here, I've done this, hundreds of times I've done this, and every single time the colors red and black are usually the first to come up. And I went to a seminar on color therapy once, and the guy was saying that anytime you ask a child to draw a traumatic experience, they will use the colors red and black.
Yes.
Isn't that interesting? Right?
I experienced with my son when I took him.
Yep.
He did have a brown, but all of the colors that he picked were always really dark colors.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. So, and then with the food, does anybody like cookies, cake, and ice cream? You're like, yes.
Yes.
Right? So, and then I think I heard you say, wait, I like pork. And does anybody like onions? Right? So what does it mean? Because every one of these on this list is correct. So what does it mean if some of us like these things and if some of us think that they're shame? What does that say about shame?
Not everyone feels the same.
Bingo!
Yeah.
A+. Shame is in the eye of the beholder. So shame is different for everybody, right? So one thing that happens to me, I might be like, la-di-da, and that might be a really shaming experience for you. So that's another thing to really think about it when we talk about empathy, is that these things are very different for everybody, right? Anything else you notice about this exercise?
Well, like on the food, the food section, those things we feel guilty about eating because we know they're bad for us, like cookies and cake and ice cream and donuts.
Mhm.
Those are all.
Well, I'm gonna challenge. So what she said was that we know these things are bad.
Yes.
Right? If we, nutritionists will tell you that if you keep categories of food in good and bad, that is actually really unhelpful for us in terms of actually eating in a way that supports our bodies. Because if I say these things are bad and I tell myself I can never have them, I'm going to obsess about having them.
Yes.
And I'm likely going to sabotage myself at some point, right? But if I think about these things in terms of, I can't only eat this, I have to eat vegetables and gotta have onions every once in a while, right? Then I'm more likely to eat a well-balanced diet, right? So we can kind of relate that to the emotions as well, because a lot of times when I do these seminars, people will say, well, shame is bad. How do I just not feel shame? I can't grant you that. If I were a fairy godmother and could do it, I would, but I can't, because if you're human and you're not a sociopath, you are going to experience shame. It's really just recognizing it and then learning how to move through it, which is what we're gonna continue to do here. So let me put this down.
That's what I was thinking when you were talking about.
Mhm.
Shame is not bad either because,
Right.
because I feel shame walking around naked. I dress, so I don't think it's not bad to feel ashamed or I don't know if it's the same shame.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly right. So shame in and of itself is not bad because, as we discussed earlier, emotions are just information, and it's part of the story that we make up about ourselves. And when it comes to I feel ashamed walking around with my naked body, so I put clothes on. That's helping us continue to be in society, because if you go around walking naked, something's going to happen, right? I don't know what it is, but it's probably not going to be great. So that actually protects us, and the function of shame originally for humans in groups were to keep us behaving essentially the same way, right? But in modern society, we've grown out of that, and shame has essentially lost a lot of its initial function, and it over functions, and then can keep us from being kind to ourselves, can keep us from showing up in life in the way that we want to. So it's not a bad thing, but if we aren't aware of it, it can do bad things to us, right? So let's define some of these things, because I asked you to list the words of shame, and every time you always fall for my trap. They always say guilt and embarrassment in that too. But guilt, shame, humiliation, and embarrassment are actually very different experiences, and it can be really important to know what each of these things are so that we know what we're dealing with, right? So the definitions here, shame being I am bad versus guilt being I did something bad. So shame, if we're feeling shame, we're feeling like a bad person. If we're feeling guilt, we recognize the thing that we've done is bad, and we can't choose, right? I can't wake up today and be like, I'm gonna feel guilt instead of shame, because it seems less harmful. That it's not the way that it works. But if I invite myself to use guilt self-talk instead of shame self-talk, that actually is really helpful, right? So, if I did something and I said to myself, oh, I'm so stupid, that's actually not helpful at all. But if I say, that was a really stupid choice, I can then potentially do something different next time. But if I'm stupid, then it's over. Game over. And there's nothing I can do about that.
Okay. That means we need to come to a terms that the shame is not a good word for us. We can't even say that the shame is not bad, because once that we realize that we are ashamed of something, that means we are moving from shame to something else, right?
Well, it's recognizing shame and then figuring out what I want to do with it.
That means we are moving from that shame to another level, right?
It's the hope, right? So if I'm experiencing shame, when we experience shame, what we typically tend to do is isolate or shut down, or we act out or we act in, right? So acting out would be like lashing out at other people. Acting in would be beating ourselves up, right? And so I want to recognize that that's happening so that I'm able to make a potentially different choice. Does that help? So it's not like, oh, shame is bad, but it when I live in the shame, I might do bad things to myself or to other people. Make sense? Kind of. And then humiliation. Humiliation is a little bit different because it's essentially we feel like we didn't deserve what happened. And when we're experiencing humiliation versus shame, it can look like, like I can't believe that happened to me versus, oh, of course I'm a bad person. What do you think is different about the action that we're going to take based on those emotions? So if I'm humiliated and I feel like I didn't deserve it, what might I do?
Lash out.
You might lash out. Defend, right? I might stand up for myself, right? But if I feel shame and I just feel like I'm bad, what are the chances of taking action there? Not a lot, right? So humiliation, we can look at it as not necessarily a bad thing because humiliation actually propels us to do something, right? And then embarrassment. So embarrassment is essentially the least painful of these emotions here. And embarrassment, we recognize that it's happened to somebody else. And so for a minute, I might feel like an idiot, but like very shortly afterwards, I'm able to recognize that it was just something silly and not a big deal. And we can feel all these different emotions in absolutely any circumstance. So like we realized with this exercise that shame is in the eye of the beholder. If you tell me a story, I can't tell you what emotion you're feeling. Only you can tell me that based on the story that you've made up about it, right? Make sense? Okay. So from Brene Brown's perspective, who's heard of Brene Brown? Oh, double hands up, okay? So if you haven't read her books, it can be really, really helpful. I would recommend Daring Greatly as her book to read, because that's the one that kind of it encompasses most of what we're talking about today. But so she's in the social work field, which I'm a social worker, and her big thing is authenticity, shame, and vulnerability. And she says that shame is the intensely painful, I don't know why it's cut off there, but shame is the intensely painful feeling that we are not worthy of love and belonging. So that's the long definition, but the short version of that is essentially feeling not good enough, or being afraid of not being good enough for connection, right? Does that resonate with people? Mm-hmm. And I'd also offer, if this doesn't resonate with you, what I would offer is that I have found that shame kind of goes in one of two ways. And if you're somebody who resonates with this definition, then you may be well aware of when you're experiencing pain, and you know it, and you're like, I feel it, and I want to stop feeling it. And then there are people on the other side who are so good at shutting out that emotion because it's just too painful to tolerate. Because I know that there aren't any sociopaths in this room. I could feel one a mile away. If you don't know where your shame is, it's super duper important to get curious about it, because if we're not recognizing where shame shows up in our lives, it can act out in really nasty ways and can prevent us from being in relationship. Because we talked about vulnerability earlier, right? And if we're not practicing vulnerability with safe people, we've got that wall up, and that's what can happen with shame too. Is it's one of the most painful emotions I think that we can experience, and so our brains don't want to feel that, our bodies don't want to feel it, and so we can shut it off. Yeah, is this resonating? Is it making sense? Awesome.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
When you said that you can spot a sociopath miles away, do you think that that's based off of your just the history of you, your personal experience? Mm-hmm. Your education and training, or more spiritual overall?
All of the above. But somebody asked me recently, they were like, when you meet people, are you like assessing them in your head? And I said, yes, but I was doing that before I was a therapist. I just happen to actually have tools now that I can, diagnose. I don't go around diagnosing everyone, but it's again, it's kind of back to this, like the judgment, the things that we're doing in order to figure out what's safe and what's not safe. Right, and as I became a therapist, I recognized that what was safe and unsafe changed from before. But yeah, I've always had kind of that like intuitive knowing, which is part of why I became a therapist. Yeah, so you don't have to have a degree in order to spot a sociopath. I'm sure you can too. I'm guessing that's why you asked that question. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. So this is another space where you might start thinking about yourself as a parent instead of thinking of yourself as a human. But shame is a result of what we call developmental trauma. So earlier we looked at that ACEs study where we looked at the 10 things essentially that quote unquote count as trauma, but those aren't the only thing that count as trauma. Developmental trauma essentially is when a child experiences not being attuned to. And when I say attunement, it's essentially if the baby's crying, we want to be like, oh, poor sweet baby, right? That could be attunement in order to recognize what an infant or a young child might be feeling. And when it happens on a chronic basis that the child does not receive attunement, the child starts to just know that they are bad. Right? Because if you think about that little baby back there, how old's your baby?
4 months.
4 months. Can that baby talk and think about what's happening in the experience? No. But the baby knows what's safe and not safe, right?
Yes.
How do babies know that?
They
sense it. And you know what that is? That's our nervous systems, right? Our nervous systems can feel what's okay and not okay, and that's what develops later is intuition, right? And our knowing. So and sometimes we lose touch with that.
Right.
But what can happen in early childhood if we don't have that attunement, we start to believe that we're wrong and we're bad. And a lot of it has to do with our parents being able to regulate their own lives in order to see us clearly. Make sense? So the result here, so the child, a baby has to have their parent, right? Or they're gonna die. Like it literally is a survival thing. And so if a child is not getting attuned to and not getting what they need, they start to blame self because they cannot imagine that their parent is bad. They have to imagine that they are bad because it would be a threat to survival if they imagined that the parent was bad, right? And for those of us growing up in homes who did assert our own authenticity, did anybody get punished for it? I did. I was the one in the house going, shit's not right. There is something not right going on. And I was told I was crazy, right?
My mother used to tell me loose lips and shit.
Right.
Because I was trying to express myself in an environment that allowed me to express myself, so I shut down.
Right. So that's exactly what happens. We shut down our connection with our authenticity, right? And then we wonder why, like, we have so much addiction and suicide and mental illness. We wonder that's exactly why, because we have lost connection with ourselves. And a lot of this information comes from, his name is Lawrence Heller, Dr. Lawrence Heller. It's a trauma training that I've been involved in, and he's got a book called Healing Developmental Trauma that can be really helpful to read if you're interested. Lawrence Heller, Heller.
And what's the book called?
Healing Developmental Trauma. Yeah. So there's that physiological, I guess, development of shame that happens really early on in life, and then we go out into the world and we experience it cognitively as well, right? So there's kind of essentially those two different experiences. So shame first develops in the attachment relationship with caregivers, and then we experience it cognitively with messages from family and beyond. So anybody raised in a household where you were overtly shamed and somebody said, you're good for nothing, or da 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 da. Anybody raised in a household like that? Yeah, some people were, right? And then there are the covert ways that it shows up, and these, you know, I don't want to say that one is better than the other, but it's almost better if you heard you good for nothing, because you can point to it. You're like, that was not okay, right? But when we have these covert experiences of shame, it takes a lot more investigating in order to recognize that it actually happened. So for rigid ideologies, so essentially if you live in a family system where there's a rigid way of being, it can really affect your experience of who you are. Can anybody think of a rigid way that you were raised or have seen people be raised that can cause shame?
In our house, we did a lot of yelling.
Mm-hmm.
And just loud everywhere you go.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was a normal thing. It's not.
Right.
Everybody's not.
Not everybody's yelling. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
They have a lot of different beliefs.
Right.
That can go out, even with, like you said, shame and therapy and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
They feel like you should pray to God and He will heal it versus
Right.
talk about it.
Yes. And I want to make sure to say that religion in and of itself is not bad necessarily, right? Nothing is necessarily good or bad. It's the way that it's expressed, right? So I really relate to that experience, because in my household it was, you know, you need to be saved, you need to be like Jesus. And I don't know about you, but I never succeeded in being like Jesus. And I don't know a lot of people who did. So I would then turn that on myself and say that I was bad because I wasn't doing it right. Yeah, right? Yeah, anybody from a military family? No? Well, sometimes that can be, if you know anybody who's in the military, that can potentially be, again, it's not like the military is bad, but it can potentially be really rigid, especially for men who are supposed to show up in a certain way. And if they don't, then you're weak and all of these things, and so that can be really shaming. Well, you had mentioned earlier, our friend in the black hat there mentioned loose lips sink ships, right? So was anybody raised in a household where you don't take any of the stuff outside of the family?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did some of that shit need to be taken outside? Right? but we don't do it because we want to preserve connection with our parents, right? We think we have to do that, but then we learn later that it wasn't necessarily the healthiest thing for us. And then other parental attitudes or family rules. In my family, it was really, really important to get good grades and to be a high achiever and a high performer. And that was a lot of pressure, right? There can be expectations. I've heard clients tell me that they were supposed to be a certain thing when they grew up, right? Like you're supposed to be a doctor or a lawyer. You have to be the one to perform to save this family. That's a ton of pressure, and it's hard to hold that, right? And then parent-sibling success. So, was anybody told you should be more like your brother or your sister or your cousin or whoever?
No, you know what was funny? My daughter made National Honor Society. She's a junior, and so my son, who's a freshman, I was like, "See, she made National Honor Society." He's like, "Good for her."
So you tried to shame him, and he was like, "No."
Yeah, he's like, "I'm proud of you, Nyla." Next, like, what's for dinner?
That's funny.
I can see where.
Yep, right? So are you relating to at least one or more of these things? Right. And then what happens when we go into school, right? Anybody have a shame experience in school? Yeah, because kids are the worst, right? Like, they treat each other terribly, right? And then has anybody had a shaming boss or a shaming partner or a shaming friend, right? So it starts off really early in our childhoods with our families, and then we continue to experience it, and we continue to internalize these messages. So what do? We work on our shame resilience. So the tools of shame resilience. So the first one is being able to recognize shame and recognize the things that trigger our shame, right? Because as we learned earlier, not every experience that we have is going to be shaming for everybody. So we really have to think about the areas in our lives where that really shows up. Parenting is a big one. Anybody experience shame? Maybe sometimes it comes from other parents, or sometimes it just comes from this, like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing and I'm screwing it all up. Anybody relate to that? Yeah. And isn't it funny that I'm seeing a lot of people shaking their heads with this, but I'm guessing that when you're home by yourself, you're telling yourself you're the only one. Right? And it's not true, because I see a lot of heads shaking around here. Right? So it could be parenting, it could be education related, it could be work related, it could be financial related, it could be about mental illness, it could be about addiction, it could be about absolutely anything. But it's important to think about where and when it shows up in your life. And then practicing critical awareness. Does anybody know what that term means, critical awareness? So essentially, we want to be able to kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture and think about why these messages might be happening. So body image is one that I think a lot of us can relate to, if not everyone. So body image says what? What are we supposed to look like in America? Skinny. What else? Barbie doll. Which I'm going to go ahead and name it is white. And most of y'all in here are not white. So what does that say about the shame messages that we get from our culture? Right? And it's bullshit, and we want to be able to move on. But there's a whole lot of white supremacy shit we got to deal with before that's going to happen. But we can really recognize, like, am I imposing something on myself that is A, unrealistic, and B, like, just not right, right? So that's practicing critical awareness, thinking about just like, going back to the parenting, right? Am I actually a bad parent? Or if I look around and I survey what's happening with the families I know around me, am I doing okay, right? It's not about being better than anybody else, but I mean, I just hear parenting is just constant trial and error. And are my kids alive, breathing, right? Like, and are they functioning-ish in society? Like, okay, thank you, right? Self-compassion. I love it, just emphatically shaking your head. So then once we've, practiced critical awareness and recognized where the shame is showing up in our lives, we want to be able to reach out for empathy. And so again, empathy, we want people to have earned the right to hear our stories. And we need to know that they actually know how to be empathetic, which it is not an intuitive skill, it is a learned skill. And we're gonna go through it. Another emphatic head shake from the back. Yes, ma'am. So we need to make sure that people know how to practice empathy that we're going to, and we need to know what we're asking for. Because sometimes we just want somebody to listen, and sometimes we actually want advice or problem solving or whatever it is, right? And then I added this one. This is not part of Brene Brown's list, but I added reaching in for self-compassion, because I don't know about you, but for me, I have this chronic shame that's kind of like always in the background, and I've recognized that I can go to my husband for empathy, I can go to my best friends, I can go to other therapists and talk about it, but if I am not being compassionate with myself, nothing that anybody says is going to break through that shame. Yes, ma'am. So we'll go deeper into self-compassion, and then the last part here is speaking shame. So talking about it, right? Because shame, like I said earlier, kind of makes us want to isolate and tend to go inside ourselves, but we really need to be able to speak it out loud. Making sense? Okay.
Question, would
Yes.
victim mentality be one of those?
Ooh, victim mentality?
Yeah.
Hold that, and when we get to self-compassion, we will talk about that, because that is super duper important. Great knowing. Okay, next we're going to look at the antidotes to shame, empathy and self-compassion. And I showed this video last time, and we actually don't have internet access today, so I can't show it again. But if you Google Brene Brown empathy, this will come up. And it talks about the difference between empathy and sympathy. So for those of you who've seen it, does anybody want to describe what the difference is? Sure.
What I remember is sympathy is just looking at her and all, I'm sorry for what you're feeling. And empathy, it's like joy. Like
Yes.
I remember like the bear got into the
Yes.
little cloud too.
Yes, exactly. It's sharing in the emotion. Right. So sympathy is feeling for you, and it creates distance. It's like, oh, you poor thing. Whereas empathy is this connection, the shared experience.
And that's different than that whole thing of the silver lining. For example,
Yes.
I had a miscarriage, and then she turns around and says, well, at least you know you get pregnant.
Yes.
That's the sort of the silver lining instead of
Right.
I've been there before, or,
Right.
yeah, so.
And why do we do that? Because I'm sure that all of us in this room, myself included, when somebody shares something hard, we may have said, well, at least, blah, 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 right? Why do we do that? What are we trying to do? You're trying to make them feel better, right? This is why I said empathy is not intuitive, right? Because the first thing that we want to do is we want to solve people's pain. And truly, can we do that? No. Guess what? Pain is part of the human experience, and it sucks. But we're not gonna, there's no way we're gonna get through this life avoiding pain altogether. So recognizing that that's a human experience is so important, and recognizing it's not our job to fix anybody's feelings, right? Especially your children, right? It's not your job to fix your children's feelings, but I've heard somebody said to me once, having a kid is like having your heart ripped out of you and have it walk around outside.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not a parent, but I can only imagine what it must feel like if that child comes home and they've been hurt. All you want to do is fix it.
I think Brene Brown says it really well. Like you said, not fixing your child's hurt or pain, but like sitting there with them and feeling it with them in that moment. I heard exactly how she says it in her parenting manifesto.
Yeah,
She
yeah.
says at the end, and I'm like, oh, so instead of like trying to fix it for my daughter, let me sit with you in that pain and help you kind of feel better and just be there.
Yes.
So that was like really powerful, and it made me think of that.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
But you know, that is so difficult to do.
Yes.
Just recently, there was this viral video of this poor child that suffered orgasm and, you know, the child had to go to, you know, disconjugate phase, and then the baby went to school, it's within Australia, and they made fun of him, so we came home, and she FaceTimed it and explained, this is what happened to my son, and it was just a horrific thing, but, you know, there's a great ending to it. But how can we not fix that? I mean, they, you know, kids are on loan. I mean, we've got to fix it, right?
No, because they need to learn to regulate and move through their own emotions, because what happens when we don't let children learn that for themselves, they really have a hard time being uncomfortable in the world, and they're going to be uncomfortable at some point, right? Because when you let your children go, I'll get to you in just a second, when your children go off to school, right, what I see with the kids who are never able to experience moving through their own emotions, they might turn to substance use, or they might turn to other ways of numbing the pain that is actually not serving them at their best, right? So was it Mary? Mary? So what Mary said, essentially, just sitting with them in their pain, that actually creates a lot of healing, but we can't fix the actual emotion. We just cannot fix the emotions of others. I can tell you as a therapist, the amount of times that I've had people come to me in pain, I am not there to fix your feelings, right? And I have one client in particular who's always like, make it better. And I'm like, I can't, buddy. All I can do is sit here with you and share in this, right? And that it can be so hard, but if you think about your own experiences of pain, has anybody fixed it, or has time and connection just made it better?
It's just like something that I've been going through recently. My husband's son was murdered on the 10th of January.
Oh my God.
And all I can do is sit with him.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't fix it. I could just sit
Right.
with him.
Right.
And you could just literally like you could see the pain.
Right.
See it. That it's
Yes.
every day is like it's elevating instead of getting better, it's getting worse daily. And there's nothing I could do. I could just sit with it.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that experience, because I think losing a child, and especially losing a child to some senseless violence, that's got to be the worst pain anyone can experience.
And one good night, the night they arrested the young man for first-degree murder, and he slept that night, the only.
Wow. And for you to have the humility to recognize that you can't fix it is huge. Because let me tell you what happens when we try to fix it. My husband and I had this issue for a little while, and I was in a lot of pain, and he was like trying to do everything he could to make it better. I got pissed.
Yeah, I don't want to frustrate him. So
Right.
I'm just quiet. And when he wants me to talk, I'll talk.
Right.
If not, then because I don't know his feelings.
Right.
I don't know what he's going through.
Right.
My sons are still here.
Right.
So I really can't say I know what you feel. I don't.
No, it's such a dangerous phrase to say. I know how you
It
feel.
is. It's not,
Even
you
if
shouldn't, because it's not true. If you're not
Right.
never been through that.
Even if you've been through it, I feel like it's still
It's
a
different.
It's a
emotion.
different. Yeah.
Right. And especially when we're talking about grief. Grief is one of the most complex emotions, because grief encapsulates a whole host of things, right? Like, I always talk about, both my parents had passed away, and I did not have a good relationship with either of them. And so when people would tell me, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss, I'd get pissed, because I was like, that's not what it is. Like, there's so much more than that, and it felt really invalidating to me, which is why just sitting with somebody in that experience is what's part of the healing. Thank you for sharing that.
Rub 'em and
Yeah.
kiss 'em and
Right. Give love.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So a therapist just does what a parent does. They just sit there and be there. And you were saying when you do your therapy sessions, you're not there to tell them their emotions.
Right.
Just as well as a parent can't tell their
Right.
children what their emotions.
It's very astute that you would say that being a therapist is a lot like being a parent, because, as I said earlier, the invitation here for you today is really think about how you parent yourself, right? A lot of us didn't get the type of parenting that we really needed and wanted, and that is sad, right? And we need to be able to give that to ourselves. So what I do for clients is essentially model what that looks like, and I give them options. usually, you know, and truthfully, most of my clients, they're not in pain every single session, because you don't have to be in pain to go to therapy. You can go because you just want to learn more about yourself.
I was telling my friend that she keeps saying, I don't see nothing wrong with me. I said, does it have to be something wrong with you to go to therapy?
No, there doesn't.
You don't know what you may discover about yourself that you wouldn't have found out on your own.
Exactly.
They have techniques to help
you.
dig
That's what I
in.
say all
Yes.
the time. Girl.
Yes,
That
yes.
A stranger, they can pull something out of you that
That's
nobody
right.
else can pull.
That's right. Yeah. In the back?
With empathy in this day and age and being empathetic and people taking that for granted.
Yeah.
So now we have with social media and everything, because to your point, that information you mentioned, it turned out to be a scam.
Wow.
Right? Like the mom had like a bunch of money or whatever from it,
Wow.
and a lot of people were empathetic or trying to be, and they wanted to do something about
Right.
the situation instead of, like you said, just sitting there with it.
Mhm.
It makes you, I'm an empath. I'm an empath, and I actually
Mhm.
end up marrying a narcissistic personality. And
Ooh.
trying those types because of that. So
Yep.
now I'm trying to work on myself,
Yes.
and myself healing with like through Brene Brown
Yes.
and research, and trying not to have any feeling, but I have to be careful about
Yep.
who I sit there with, right?
Right.
Because some people will take advantage of you even sitting there with them, and whatever it is, some people need that, and it can become like an enabling kind of thing.
Yes.
Codependency.
Mhm.
So how do you learn how to, I guess, filter it? Because I'm like, I went from a point in my life where I cared about everybody's stuff and took
Yep.
it on, to now I'm like, I can't, I don't want to hear it, I
Yeah.
can't take it. Because I don't want to try to feel like I have to do something about it, or
Right.
I don't know how to just sit there in it when people are used to me trying to do something about it. They like,
Mhm.
I try to sit there and listen like, okay,
Yeah.
how does that make me feel? And do all of that. And they're looking at me like, really?
Yeah.
You're not gonna come out your bed with something to take this away?
Well, what you'll probably find is the healthier that you get, if the people around you aren't also doing that work, it may be a lot harder to communicate. When you ask how do you develop some of those boundaries, I go to Al-Anon. That's one thing that I do, and I've learned different ways to set boundaries there. And essentially, it's really about how do I sit with the pain of knowing I'm hurting somebody else when I've set the boundary, right? Because I've a couple people in my life who, show up in a way that I'm not going to offer you pity. I'm not going to offer you sympathy. I have empathy and I have love.
Right. That's big.
But they don't want that. And so it's really, really hard to be in connection. And so then I am left with sitting with the pain of losing this relationship. She rolls her eyes, right? I know.
Everybody, your family, like,
I know.
there is no boundary for everybody when you're doing that being a parent.
Yeah. I mean, family is the hardest, right? Because we're stuck with them. It's so hard.
I tell myself, well, Sheila, everybody can't go where you go. You're
Yeah.
trying to go to another level. Everybody can't go.
Right.
Even if it's family.
Right.
So that's how I would separate myself from.
Yeah. And I really hear you embracing this whole put your oxygen mask on before helping others.
Yes.
And you're right. Not everybody's going to make that choice in this lifetime. So I'm really glad that you're able to sit with that for yourself. Yeah. Well, let's move into the ways that we can work on our skills of empathy. So, and this is all from Brene Brown. So the first one is staying out of judgment. And you notice that it doesn't say don't judge. Like we talked about earlier, judgment is kind of part of the human experience. So it's, am I holding on to that judgment, or am I trying to let it soften, right? So if somebody shares something with you, sometimes our first reaction is, well, why did you do that? That's judgment. So don't do that, right? You can think it and you can be curious about it, but when I ask that question in my head, I'm thinking about the life experiences of that person, right? Because I might not have acted that way, but if I think about why that person may have acted that way, usually it makes sense, right? And I'm gonna bring up a little controversial topic here, but even some people who kill other people, right? It's not okay. Let me be very clear. Murder is not good. It is not okay, and people should be punished for it. But I know that people who do quote unquote bad things are people who have been hurt themselves, right? We know that child molesters were molested as children themselves, right? All of these things that are really, really, really terrible, it's not necessarily because this person is an awful human. They do need to be punished again.
I argue that with people all the time, and they feel like I'm making excuses for a person's behavior, but what I try to do is make you not take it personal what they did to you, because I'm not saying it's okay what they did.
Exactly.
But I'm trying to get you to understand where it came from.
Exactly.
So you won't think it was directed to you. Because you have to protect your heart at all costs. And your feelings and your emotions. And the way you see it, you're like it's a direct attack against you.
Exactly. One of the things that we say in Al-Anon is what other people think of me is none of my business.
Right. I see that.
That's
your issue.
Yes, right, it is. And it's hard to practice that, right? But it's a practice. And I'm sure you didn't just like wake up one day and that's how it was. You probably cultivated that for yourself, I'm guessing. Yeah. So this is where we go into perspective taking too. So I want to be able to take somebody else's perspective, right? So that's what you're doing when you're thinking about why did that person behave that way? I'm putting myself really truly in their shoes. And the reality is we can never completely put ourselves in somebody's shoes. It's kind of like I think of like the Freaky Friday movies where there's like the parent-child switch or whatever, right? Like your kids will never be in your shoes, and unfortunately it is a thankless job, just like being a therapist. It is a thankless job sometimes. Yes. Emphatic head nod in the back. I love it. And so, but we want to try when someone is sharing something painful with us to take their perspective of why is this hurtful for you, right? And then recognizing the emotion. So we did that earlier, right? And we can't necessarily just tell by how people are looking, and sometimes we can't even tell by what people are saying, because truthfully sometimes people don't even know how they feel. My husband is a good example of this. He really, really struggles to know what he's feeling in a certain moment. And I've really tried to challenge him and be like, honey, I can't help you and support you until you tell me what it is that you need, right? And then the last piece here is communicating and understanding of that. So the exercise that we did right at the beginning of this where I said, it looks like you might be feeling angry. Did I get that right? Like that can be a way to communicate that you understand the emotion somebody's experiencing. Or again with grief, like when it's a really complex emotion like that, I don't ask what people are feeling because it's usually so acute and so painful. And that's when I'll go to the I can't even imagine what you must be feeling right now, but let me sit with you, or let me make you a meal or something like that. Make sense to everybody? Cool. So now we're going to do an exercise. So I want everybody to get a partner, and I'll explain it first, then we'll have to get you partners, and then I'll explain it again because people often get confused. So you're going to choose a partner, and you're going to decide who is partner A and who is partner B. And then what we're going to do is partner A, you excited now? So partner A is going to think about a time when you've experienced shame, and then you're going to put yourself in a physical pose that expresses that shame, right? So it can be just facial expression, or you can use the floor or whatever, you can do whatever. And I want you to, we're going to have you hold that in silence. And partner B is just going to witness what partner A is doing. And then we're going to switch, but partner B is going to do the exact same pose that partner A just did. And then we'll switch and partner B will get to pick their own pose. Does that make sense? So you're not talking. Right. So you're not explaining anything. So this can be a really intimate experience for you because we are not going to talk about it. We are not going to tell the person what it was that happened, okay? So it's all just going to be within you. All right? So does everybody have a partner? Find somebody who can be a partner? Okay, so partner A's, raise your hand real quick. Partner A's. All right. Okay, so partner A, go ahead and take your pose, and partner B, we're just going to witness. We're just going to hold space. So think of a time you felt shame, and we're going to do this without talking. partner B, you're just witnessing partner A in their pose right now. Okay, break. Now without talking, so partner B, now you are gonna do the exact same pose that partner A just did, okay? And so partner A, you're gonna watch partner B do your pose. Make sense? And go. Break. Okay, so now we're going to switch partner B. You're going to come up with your own pose, and partner A is going to witness that. Okay? Break. And so now partner A is going to do what partner B was just doing, and partner B gets to witness their own pose. Break. I'm just going to say you're better than therapists at this exercise. When I do this with therapists, there's giggling, there's talking, they have a hard time doing it. You guys, A+ to everybody here. So I'm curious what you noticed with this experience.
It was kind of like out of body.
Say more.
It was, well, she did it so well, but it was just like seeing myself in her and the what it is that I'm projecting, or even the depth of the shame or frustration or hurt.
Yeah.
It was just visible. It made it visible.
Yeah. Right. Thank you.
It's the same way I can feel the shame, the hurt, the disappointment, and like basically the feeling was saying like why, like what, why? I can't believe it.
And was that when you were witnessing her doing your pose or when you took on her pose?
I felt it with both.
Both.
When she did my pose, I mean, I felt that she did everything that I was feeling inside. And when I saw her do her own, it was so much similar, but also different.
I felt the same way with her. It was like, almost feeling the same thing, but it was like I had words to put to it, even though she wasn't saying it.
Yeah. And that's an empathic connection, right? Absolutely. Anybody else?
You see how with her expression, sometimes it makes you feel like, man, you're not adequate. You feel sort of demeaned. Then I can also see when people say I have a wall up. I don't let people get so far, and I couldn't,
Wow.
So when she did my pose, I'm like, man, I can see that is, I do have, that's me, I put that wall up.
Wow, so you were able to experience yourself in a different way. Wow, good job. You must be an excellent actor. Yeah, anybody else want to share?
I noticed something about my personality, and it came a little bit more clear with her because I was A. I was A and she was B, and I did my pose by like quick. It was like, hey, I'm done, and she took it more time. I'm the kind of person that I don't give permission myself to suffer for something for a long time.
Yeah.
You cry 2 minutes, over, done. And sometimes I'm trying to be more patient with my kids. I have 4 girls, so not
bless you.
Not everybody's like that. And sometimes I'm trying, encouraging them, but I'm like, get over it. Don't cry so much for the same thing. And I noticed that, like, when she copied me, she took longer than I did myself.
Yeah.
And I know it's because I'm like,
right? Yeah.
I don't like to suffer for the same thing for a long time.
Well, I'll offer this, is that suffering is optional. Pain we're just going to experience, but suffering is optional, right? And we want to, the hope is that we will give ourselves time to experience pain and move through it. We have to sit with the emotion because it's stored somewhere, right? It gets locked in our bodies, or sometimes it comes out in the way we treat other people or the way we treat ourselves, right? So we want to give time for that emotion, but that doesn't mean we have to suffer with it, because suffering is part of the story that we tell ourselves.
I don't take time to feel emotions.
Yeah.
Not much.
Thank you. Anybody else?
What I noticed, as far as my daughter, she knows when something wrong with me. She's like, there was this exercise remind me of when you around your family, especially the ones that's close to you, like your husband or your wife or your children. They knows when their parents are hurting.
Yeah.
Just like the little baby just told her mom with the eyes, right, your eyes closed, and it brought me into time with my daughter. And she said, Mama, are you okay? Why are you looking like that?
Yeah.
Your mom, your eyes were, are you okay today? And this moment brought me back to exercise, brought back to my daughter. Because kids tends, husband or wife tends knows when something's wrong.
Right.
Because they've been around you so many years. And they knows when you're happy, sad, and
Which goes back to, sometimes I hear parents trying to protect their kids from something that's going on, right? Like, I don't want to burden my children with my feelings, but they already know something's wrong, so you better talk about it, right? Keeping children in silence actually creates more anxiety and less safety, rather than just saying, Mommy feels sad, right? Like, you don't have to necessarily tell the child what's going on, all the details. I've got one client who's really, really, really good at sharing with her son when she's feeling pain, and then he's like, oh, okay, bye, right? And so he is well adjusted now to recognizing that Mom experiences pain sometimes. And the hope is that that's a good model for him when he starts to really develop his emotional intelligence. And I did actually want to say something about what happened back there. So has anybody heard of the still face experiment? Write this down. Go Google it when you get home, because it's really, really interesting. So the still face experiment is, this is looking at attachment and attunement. So we were talking about that earlier, right? And what the mother does is, it's a mother and an infant. and the mother is playing with the baby, and the baby's like cooing, and kind of the baby's pointing, and mom will look, and then at some point the people ask her to be a blank slate.
I saw the video. Yeah, and the baby started crying.
The
when
baby
he saw
starts freaking
reaction.
out. She didn't
It's
freak
like,
out.
What's going on?
Right? But the baby's like, "What's wrong, Mama? Open your eyes, Mama." Like that shows that the attachment and attunement between you two is good, because she recognized when you weren't okay, and you did the exact right thing. You were just like, "Honey, it's okay," right? Giving her that soothing, and that, because she needed to know that you were all right. So if it's really hard to watch, because it's hard to watch the baby be in distress, but the mother turns back on, and then the baby is able to calm themselves
Yeah,
again.
that's the other thing about babies. They
Yes.
can recuperate like
Still
soon,
basics.
like
Right.
that fast.
Exactly.
I think that's one of the hardest things for parents though, because I know that like her, she has 4 girls, I have 3, and they easily tune in when they see something that's wrong with me, so I often try to act like the NFL players, you play her. So I'm just, I'm okay, and jumping, and so that's a hard part for parents
Right.
to deal with. I know me as a mom, to kind of act like you're okay all the time, because you know that they pick up on the self-esteem, even mine, like, are you okay? Something's not right, and even though the world is like crumbling, I don't want them to feel like they have to take it on. So I'm like, no, we're fine, and I'm joking and playing with them and stuff like that. So
It's a way to model boundaries, though, because if you're experiencing pain and it's not their job to fix it, you can communicate that to them, right? Yeah, like my feelings are hurt, whatever it is that it happens, right? Yeah, mommy's feelings were hurt. And you don't have to fix it. It's okay to be sad sometimes. That's an excellent model for your children. Yeah. Anybody else? Any comments about the exercise?
I would say I struggled with trying to go there in my head and show that time I felt shame. So when you said that, I was like, why don't you be that? Because I don't know how to show. I mean, I knew where that time in my life I felt a lot of shame, but I couldn't act it out. So she went first. I felt like we went right there, and I was like,
Yeah.
So I got that moment. It took me a minute to figure out how can I articulate it through my body.
Right.
Show that body language of how I was feeling shame.
Right. Well, and what's interesting is whenever I've done this exercise, the way that people visibly express shame is usually really similar, right? We saw a lot of heads down, a lot of this, right? So it is very similar. Yeah. Anybody else?
I just think it's interesting that it was sort of hard, like she was saying, sort of hard for me to go back to that stage and we felt shame. And with my son having a similar incident at his school, the weight shaming and whatnot, and then stuff like that, and I'm like, man, it hurts so bad that you see them go through this, and then, But it also taught me how to, I had to break down my wall. Like, when I was younger, I had to go through such and such and such. I'm not saying this right, but we all go through things, and you have to break down to your kid how you need to handle this.
Right.
And, because like what you said, you're right. And I'm like, you're gonna have to get this anger out. You can't keep holding it in, because it's gonna manifest in a bad way.
Exactly.
And I'm like, you need to just start writing a journal, so I gave him a lot of options, and he wanted to write a journal,
Wonderful.
So I'm like, it's good, because you can't keep holding that in. I'm like, you might not want to talk to me about it if you want to, because I don't want him to be like me, putting up walls.
Right.
Because he's totally outgoing, and I'm like, I'm really not. So I don't want to. I'm like, man, you talk too much. You talk to everybody. But I had to stop. I'm like, I can't do that. That's how you are.
Right. And truthfully, you as the parent, you're going to be probably the last person your kid talks to.
Yeah.
That's just how it is. So, the hope is that they have safe relationships with other adults in their life, whether it be a teacher or you've got the mentor program here, right? That's amazing that you all have given your children that gift.
He had therapy sessions.
Right. And therapy, all of these things. So, and reminding yourself, when your kid goes to somebody else instead of you, it's not about you, right? It's just like, right? You're like, I know. Exactly. Right.
I want you to, but I'm like, I don't want you to get it out.
Right, exactly, right. But it isn't. It doesn't mean that you're not a good parent if your child doesn't come to you. This is just kind of the nature of the. That's just how it works, right? So let's move on to the last piece that we're going to talk about here, self-compassion. So self-compassion, I have found personally and professionally when I work with people that self-compassion can be one of the most difficult things to practice, but it is absolutely crucial in order to take care of ourselves. Because if we're skipping this step, we're missing a really, really big piece that we absolutely have to have. So a quote from Brené Brown here, self-compassion is key because when we're able to be gentle with ourselves in the midst of shame, we're more likely to reach out, connect, and experience empathy, right? So empathy and self-compassion, it's two sides of the same coin, right? Self-compassion is actually self-empathy. So what is self-compassion? Let's talk about what it is, and then we'll talk about what it isn't as well. So compassion means to suffer with. So self-compassion, to suffer with oneself. How about that? Pretty simple, right? So it's a recognition that we're experiencing suffering and then being kind about it. So what happens when you notice that you're feeling or you're having a tough time? What do you say to yourself sometimes when you're having a tough time? Get over it. Right? Who says that to themselves? Move on, right? Or, sometimes I'm judging myself for judging myself, or I'm shaming myself for shaming myself, right? So we're only lumping kind of more onto ourselves when we do that, and we go back to kind of the attachment and attunement piece and the way that shame is created. That's why we do that, because that's kind of how our brains were wired. So it's not bad that we do that. We just need to start noticing that. So we just want to be able to notice, I'm having a moment of suffering, or you don't have to say suffering because that can sound a little too much, but I'm in pain right now, and this sucks. This is hard. That's all it is. It is not practicing good feelings. So affirmations, you heard it here, affirmations alone don't cut it. Because when we're just affirming, we're not making space for the fact that something sucks, right? Because has anybody ever told you, like, well, look on the bright side? And how does that feel when people tell you to look on the bright side? Shut up and I will punch you in the face. So if you're doing that to yourself, it's not helping, right? Anybody watch SNL in the 90s with Stuart Smalley? You know what I'm talking about? You're good enough, you're smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like you. He was playing this like self-help character, but it doesn't work. Self-compassion is an invitation to hold both at the same time. The pain that we're experiencing and the belief that we are a person worthy of compassion, right? And I'm curious, does anybody in here have the mental thought that maybe I'm not worthy of compassion? Does anybody have that?
You know what, and I may be a little long-winded with this, so forgive me.
Please bring it.
So I do watch Oprah and Yamla and Brene kind of frequently. And so what's kind of, I don't know, it's conflicting when one is in the space of going through a traumatic experience or getting over that experience or dealing with the pain or the effects of that experience. From a divorce to career change, whatever the case may be, whatever it is that we go through that provides different emotions. And so in watching Oprah, I think it was actually a panel with Oprah, Renee, and Iyanla, if I'm not mistaken, but there was a woman who, she was kind of on they were talking to her via Skype. She was in prison, and she had just this squeaky clean image, and she was just a mom, and a soccer mom, and a working mom, a wife, and all of this and that, and just one split moment she had road rage and killed someone or something like that. And she had never so much as had like a parking ticket before. And she said that she was trying to talk to like the people around her, and everyone would just say like, you're so strong, you're you're so strong, you'll figure it out, or just pray about it, or start going to this church instead of, maybe that's not the right church for you, maybe you should be at this church, or you'll figure it out, or pray about it, or whatever the situation may be. She said she just reached out so many times for help, and she was just always kind of brushed to the side. And so it just provides such a thin line, because even with specifically Iyanla herself, if you watch her show, Iyanla Fix My Life, there's just such a contrast. On one show, she'll tell people to be vulnerable and express, and to marinate in and acknowledge what their hurt or their feelings are. And then there can be a direct other show, and she'll say, you're making that your story. Why is that your story? This is what you continue to tell yourself. In order to get over it, this has to stop being your story. So it's like,
this is a really, really great point, because, and I deal with this as a therapist, when there's a line at which it becomes victim mode. Right? You asked about this earlier, so let's go ahead and talk about it. So, and it's not necessarily that overt that it's victim mode, but we have to let ourselves experience the feeling so that they move through. But sometimes people hold on to the feeling, and that is not healthy, right? And that is, so what might happen is if a client comes in and they complain about the same stuff over and over and over, right? My husband's a jerk, whatever, and saying the same thing over and over again, then that's when I start to challenge, right? Why are you telling this story? What is the benefit of you staying in a marriage when your husband's a jerk, right? So it can be difficult for, actually it's probably not difficult, because you can probably feel with the people in your life when they're holding on to and like making themselves a victim out of it, or when they're just experiencing pain. I kind of just sense a lot of things, and it feels like there's like a purity to when someone is just experiencing pain, and there's like barbs when it's kind of like I'm in this victim space. You know what I mean? That's what the difference feels like to me. So she's right on both sides.
Depending on what situation she was dealing with, that's why she got to tell it to that person, and then the other person is a different situation.
She used reverse psychology.
She looking through them and could tell, oh, she's playing the victim. And this person is really in a pure emotional state.
And as we move through this, we'll get to a slide where I'm going to kind of break some of that down for how can we recognize ourselves when we've put ourselves in the victim role. So again, back to this idea of, we're not practicing, affirmations. We're not just saying everything is okay, because sometimes things are not okay. The experience that you shared with us, that is not okay. Right? And I hope that your husband is able to practice compassion for his own pain in sitting with that, because, justice should be served, right? Like we were talking about earlier, if somebody does something to hurt somebody else, there are consequences for that, and your husband has a right to want those consequences, right? But to be able to sit with that suffering of himself and be like, this is just awful, that would be my hope and my wish for him. So we just want to be holding space for those feelings of pain and suffering. So what self-compassion is not...
oh my God.
Is that a knowing laugh over there? That's what I'm hearing. So compassion is not self-pity, right? Because like we talked about earlier, the difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is just like, oh, you poor thing. If you're doing that to yourself, then you're actually probably in that victim mode, and it's not truly self-compassion, right? It is also not self-indulgence, and this is where I hear people say, well, if I don't shame myself for my behavior, I'll be letting myself off the hook. Doesn't mean that there are natural consequences, right? If I'm acting a fool, like, there are consequences for that. I'm going to lose relationships, or something's going to happen, and so it's you're not letting yourself off the hook. You're still experiencing the consequences, right? I work a lot with people with addiction issues, and so they end up in treatment, and they're like, well, I'm such an idiot, and da-da-da-da-da. I'm like, well, you could be compassionate with yourself for being here, because this is the consequence, right? You're already experiencing it. And then weakness, practicing self-compassion is not weakness, right? Like we talked about earlier, vulnerability, it's just a thing. It's not good or bad. It is just a thing. And if we tell ourselves that we're weak for practicing self-compassion, we are not giving ourselves the gift of that, right? And then self-esteem. So let's talk about self-esteem versus self-worth, because I often hear these things being used interchangeably, but they're different. So self-esteem is what you think, and self-worth is what you feel. So if you, in this room, if you can think of 3 to 5 things that you're good at, right? Let's say, like, I'm a good driver, or, you know, I'm whatever it is, right? Like, I know for myself, I can name a lot of things that I'm really good at, but at the end of the day, self-esteem is what we think, self-worth is what we feel. So I can list off tons of things to you. If you say, what are you good at, Sarah? I'll be like, I'm a good singer, I'm a good this, I'm a good that, right? But when it comes to how I feel about myself at the end of the day, sometimes I feel like a piece of shit. Sometimes I feel really not good enough. And that goes back to kind of this experience of chronic shame that kind of runs underneath everything. And so there's a difference then between self-esteem and self-worth. So does that make sense for folks?
Yes.
Yeah, and shine a light on things, right? So anybody in here have good self-esteem? Yeah, let's celebrate that. Another interesting thing, so there's a book called Selfie, and it's not a therapy book. It's written by a journalist. And at the beginning, he starts talking about the way that our culture has essentially shifted to a more narcissistic culture, right? And drawing individualism, making the culture more individualistic, in the line that's drawn through that, leading to this place of a lot of narcissism. And he tells the story in there about how the self-esteem movement actually happened. You want to know how it happened? It was one politician, and he, for himself, discovered self-esteem, and he asked, I think it was Stanford, or it was some college, he asked them to do a study on self-esteem. They didn't have any positive findings about self-esteem because of this difference between self-esteem and self-worth, but he was like, F that, we're gonna make this a thing anyway. And so one politician is the result of the self-esteem movement that happened in the 80s and 90s, and is the reason why poor millennials got a trophy for everything. It's false, right? Because if we're just focusing on self-esteem is based on me being better than you. And that's not going to happen every time, because there are plenty of people that are better than us at different things, right? And it's also that leads to narcissism, if I think I'm better than you, rather than having the recognition that we're all interconnected, right? So self-esteem is not what we're going for with the kids. We're going for self-worth, right? And the way that we do that is by separating behavior and worth, right? We should never tell our kids, you're a bad boy, or you're a bad girl, or you're a bad child, right? We should say, you did a bad thing, but you're still a good person, right? Because our worth should not be based on our actions. Our worth is based on just the fact that we exist, right? But bad actions should be punished. Yes, of course. Right? So, yeah. So I already said all that. Going on to the next thing. So what is self-compassion? We talked about what it's not. Let's talk about the components of self-compassion. So you'll see here Kristen Neff, and that's Kristen Neff and Brene Brown. I'll tell you also, Kristen Neff has a website, and there's a test where you can test your own self-compassion. So if you're curious, you can go to her website. It's literally self-compassion.org. And if you Google her name, it'll show up. But So she breaks self-compassion down into 3 components. The first component being mindfulness, and she actually lists them in a different order, but I put mindfulness first because I think if we don't cultivate mindfulness, we can't practice the other ones. So mindfulness is simply paying attention to the present moment without judgment, right? Because when I say mindfulness, sometimes people assume that means it's meditation, which means clearing your mind. That's not what meditation is. Meditation is actually just recognizing where your mind is. That's all it is attention. Putting your attention on a certain thing, your mind wanders, you bring it back. So we have to be able to practice mindfulness so that we recognize when we're experiencing a moment of suffering. Just like we talked about at the very beginning, being able to recognize these emotions. And one of the things that we need to do in order to do that is slow down, right? And especially, God bless you raising children in this crazy fast-paced world. I'm guessing you are on the go all the time, taking a kid here, picking up a kid there, making some food here, all the stuff that's going on. We have to slow down to be in order to be able to recognize what we're experiencing. I literally tattooed the word pause on my body so that I would remember to slow the F down. Aw, sweet little baby. So to practice mindfulness, one of the ways to increase mindfulness is meditation. And I know it's already hard for you to find time for yourself, so that might be a big ask. If it's something you're curious about, I encourage you to just go on YouTube. There's so many free things in meditation. You don't have to pay for any of that shit. There are apps, tons of apps. It's great. But just, if you decide, okay, I'm going to practice mindfulness, just set aside 5 minutes a day when you're going to do it, because you don't actually need to be alone and quiet to do it. You can do it while your children are running around doing whatever it is that they're doing. You just decide, I'm going to focus my attention on this one thing, right? I'm going to focus my attention on, there's a picture of the moon over there, so I'm looking at the picture of the moon. And my kid's doing something crazy. And then I'm going to bring back my attention to the picture of the moon. That's it. It's not rocket science. So I would encourage you to think about ways that you can incorporate mindfulness. And then the next piece of self-compassion is self-kindness. So are you talking to yourself like someone you love, or are you talking to yourself like a jerk? Right? And we mentioned earlier that when you're experiencing emotions, sometimes you're like, get over it. Yeah. And would you say that to a small child?
No. Try not to.
Right? Yeah, you might, but it's not working, is it, right?
Sometimes kids are so traumatic.
They are.
I was just thinking that I feel bad for my daughter because Wednesday on swimming, the clothes I took for her for after swimming, the pants were a little bit short on her.
Well, you're the worst mother in the world.
She was so embarrassed. They are gonna think I'm poor because I don't have a pants long enough.
Yeah.
You know how she get out from the from the lockers with the jacket backwards and the head on her face, so nobody sees it's her.
That is dramatic.
Right. Sorry, but I was laughing. It's
right. Well, see, that's the difference between victim mode versus actually experiencing pain, right? Because that's quite hyperbolic. That's a little dramatic. Right? And I wonder if there's a way that you could hold space for her fear of being ostracized from her friends. Right? Because I think sometimes what can happen as parents is we forget how painful it was to be a teenager. Is she a teen or?
No, my girls are little. And she was, that one that I'm talking about, 8.
I mean, they're basically teenagers now because kids are growing up so much faster, right?
So advanced now.
Right? So I wonder if we can hold space for the fact that there's fear that if I look a certain way, my friends aren't going to accept me. Because that's reality, because kids are jerks.
Yeah.
Right? Right? So we can hold space for that. And once we've held space for the emotion, then we can say, now, sweetie, so I was putting the drama on, right? I wonder if there's a different way that you could have moved through this.
I actually talk about it the next day because it was kind of late. We had to eat, go to sleep, we finish homework and go to sleep. So the next day, I talked to her.
That's wonderful.
I said, be honest. You will. I mean, it was a reason to be like not just crying, mad at me, yelling at your sisters, putting your jacket backwards, and get your sister guide you to the car because she couldn't see a thing.
That's
Was
impressive.
Like, yeah, that was too much.
Yeah, so she was, it sounds like, so you gave her space to feel her feelings, and then the feelings kind of softened, and once she was feeling okay, then it's when you can challenge the behavior. Exactly. Yeah, that's great. So kind of back to this idea of, are you talking to yourself like you would talk to a small child, right? So why do we try to say crappy things to ourselves? What is the purpose of that? Why do we do it?
To toughen ourselves up.
Right? Now, do you really need to toughen yourself up, or did life do that to you? Right?
So if you do too much, that's why we're saying it to ourselves.
Right. And the more we toughen up, the thicker those walls can get, right?
I would say too, like, and there's so when we look at like celebrities or maybe they're doing really great things with their life, I always seem to like compare, like, get over it. Like, she's doing it, why can't you get over it and move forward? And so that's what's in my head of like, why I don't feel like I show myself enough self-compassion or self-kindness, because I'm always like, she can do it, but then it's like, yeah, we didn't go through what she went through, so why are you not? But it takes a minute to get there and have that dialogue, but initially it's like, let's just move past it. Fine, like, I'll be good, because I'm like comparing it to someone else, and that's not healthy, but.
Well, comparison, right? Comparison is the thief of happiness, right? So if we're spending our lives comparing ourselves to other people, we're judging ourselves. And when we're talking about celebrities, we have no idea what they're going through, right? I actually really enjoy the fact that we have so much media right now, and we can see more clearly. Anybody seen Kevin Hart's documentary on Netflix? Yeah, it's super duper interesting because he talks about the controversy of being fired from the Oscars, and you watch him how he took it all very personally, and it was really, really an interesting thing to watch, and a good reminder. Like, I judge celebrities all the time. I'm like, why is Taylor Swift doing that shit? Whatever it is, right? She's got a documentary on Netflix as well where you're like recognizing the pain that people are going through. Yeah, chances are the celebrities are actually going through the same thing that you are. We just don't get to see it. We only see the pretty things. And if you're looking on Facebook and Instagram, most of the time you're only seeing the pretty stuff. So another thing that we say in the program is don't compare your insides to somebody else's outsides. Yeah. Write that one down. Take that one with you. Yeah. So I guess, in order to start practicing self-compassion for yourself, the first thing you have to do is make a decision to do that. And the decision has nothing to do with whether you're actually feeling it. It's just, I have made a decision that I am going to practice self-compassion, which means whether you feel like you're worth it or not, you've decided to engage in that practice. So the feeling like you're worth it comes with the practice. It's kind of like this chicken or egg thing. Like, well, I'm not going to practice self-compassion until I'm worth it. But you're not going to be worth it until you practice it.
Right.
So it's kind of like, it's an exercise in faith where you have to just trust that this might be an alternate way of living, because I don't know about you, but I decided at one point that beating myself up was just no longer sustainable. It was just really painful and hurting me too much. So that's the invitation to think about shifting the way that you talk to yourself. So how do we do that? First thing, we have to notice, right? We have to notice that we're saying something to ourselves. And I would ask for you to think about, what is the go-to insult that you have for yourself? I'm curious if you know what that is.
Suck it up. Don't be daft. That's it.
So don't be daft, right? You're being an idiot. What else? Mine was stupid.
Don't be dumb.
Don't be dumb, right?
Man, I can't get nothing
Yeah, I can't get anything right. Yeah. So what I would offer you is, if you figure out what that thing is that you always say to yourself, can you catch yourself doing it and then change it in the moment? That's the first step to it, right? So if I'm calling myself stupid, I made the decision at one time that instead of saying, I would catch myself saying, you're so stupid, and then I shifted it to silly. Because it was just a little bit kinder. It was still recognizing that there was a thing that was happening, that right? So I'm not negating. I'm not like, oh, you're wonderful. I'm not skipping over the pain, but it was just silly. And then over time, there was a little bit more space to be able to like, well, that wasn't even silly. Like, I remember so clearly when I started this practice, I was working somewhere where you needed a key to get in every single door. And I walked to a room and I forgot my key. And I said, you're so stupid. And I'm like, there is nothing stupid about that. That's such a human thing.
To forget.
Right? Just to forget. And in that moment, I was able to recognize just how much I was beating myself up for nothing. And all of us are doing that all the time, right? So can you shift, catch yourself and then shift that language to be something that's just a little bit kinder? And then over time, I have developed a practice where, and sometimes I have to intentionally do it, and sometimes it just magically happens, but now often I can be in a space where I just say, like, Sarah, this hurts. I'm so sorry you're in pain. Kind of talking to myself in the third person. And, you know, a lot of times therapists will say to think about yourself as a 4 or 5-year-old, because at that age, you know, you can't help but, like, think you're adorable and know that that child hasn't done anything wrong. I don't know a lot of 4 or 5-year-olds that are actually bad people, right? So if you can think about how would you talk to a 4 or 5-year-old, think about talking that way to yourself. And then the last piece, common humanity. So this is where the victim stuff really comes in. So there's common humanity on one end, which is the understanding that all of us have human struggles and we're all in it together. And then on the very other end, there's a term called terminal uniqueness, which is essentially like, I am so screwed up, I get a medal for being the most screwed up. Right? I am suffering so much, you will never understand me. That's victim, right? So that's one of the tools that I picked up from my childhood, because in my childhood it was not safe for me to be angry. If I would have been angry, I do not know what would have happened. So I had to be the victim, and I made myself small and like, oh, I'm just poor little me, so that I would not be punished, right? So that's something that I learned very, very honestly based on my childhood. But as I've grown up, I've realized that doesn't feel good. And people don't like to hang out with me when I'm acting like that. And so I've really recognized I try to pull myself to the space of common humanity. And it's something that I literally have to notice that I'm in the victim space. And then I have to go, wait a minute, no, I do believe that everybody has suffering and we're all in this together and we're all connected. And I have to literally like shift the way that I'm looking at a situation in order to remind myself of that. Does anybody else do the victim mode thing? Right? And the thing is, when we're in that victim mode space, chances are we didn't get the empathy that we deserved when something happened as a child. Right? Absolutely. And so to practice compassion with the fact that we go into victim mode is another important thing to be able to do. So are we relating to this? Awesome. Okay. So, well, this slide looks like crap because I downloaded it. But essentially, this is self-compassion for the logical mind, because I had a client once tell me that self-compassion was bullshit. And he was like, I just have to, I have to get a thing done. Yes, but oftentimes we need to practice self-compassion first in order to get to that space where we can then problem solve. So essentially, first thing we have to do is just recognize, okay, like what is causing the pain here, right? And then we want to name the feelings being experienced. Practice compassion, right? Noticing this is a moment of suffering. Reaching out for empathy from someone you trust. Hopefully they would say something empathetic to be able to hold you. And then problem solving. So problem solving comes after we deal with the emotions, because I don't remember who it was earlier, but somebody said if I'm acting from a space of emotion, I might not actually be doing the thing that is the best choice in this problem solving. Make sense? Cool. We're gonna be done a little early, is that okay? Okay, all right. All right, so now we're gonna practice self-compassion. So I would invite you, if closing your eyes is comfortable, I would invite you to do that. And I'm going to give you a couple options. So I want you to think of a time recently where you experienced some pain. And I don't want it to be like the most painful, like traumatic experience that you've had, but just, you know, maybe something where somebody hurt your feelings, or you didn't get something that you wanted, right? Think of a time when you've experienced that pain. And I'd invite you to give yourself a loving touch in some way. So for me, I like to put my hands on my heart. You may want to just fold your hands in your lap, or maybe put your hands on your stomach. But I invite you to touch yourself in some way. And you can either say, you can repeat the phrase, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be safe, may you be loved. Or you can visualize this pain as like a heavy stone and a light shining on it and kind of dissolving it. So those are the invitations. So I'll have you, if you're comfortable closing your eyes, go ahead and do that. And imagine this pain you've experienced. And touch yourself in some loving way. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you be safe. May you be loved. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you be safe. May you be loved. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you be safe. May you be loved. And I'll just be silent for a moment, and you can repeat that to yourself. Continue with your visualization. And when it's time to end, I'll guide you out. Healthy. May you be safe. May you be loved. Now I'll invite you to slowly drop the pose and slowly return to the room, and when you're ready, you can open your eyes. You care to share? What came up for you? Say again. Wonderful. So when you practice compassion, joy comes. That's beautiful. Wonderful. Anybody else?
That it works to do to you what you do to others.
Yes.
I tend to touch people's shoulders when they're talking.
Yes.
Or a hug to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It is nice to hug yourself.
Well, the reason that self-touch is invited is actually, it's in Kristen Neff's book, that oxytocin is released when we're touching ourselves, just like when somebody else is touching us. Yeah, so you're exactly right. Yeah, anybody else want to share? Well, let me also say that sometimes when we pause and give ourselves compassion, it can sometimes be really painful. And that doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. It just means that it might be something that you're not very used to. And so the more that you practice it, the more that you maybe become comfortable with it. And that's, again, all of this is just an invitation. It's just options, things that you can play with. But giving yourself a little bit of that time each day to try to be compassionate, it can't hurt, right? Right? I promise self-compassion won't make things worse in the long run. Anything else anybody wants to share about that exercise? Okay. So what gets in the way? So I love this quote by Carl Rogers, is a famous psychotherapist. I can't remember, I think in the 50s, I can't remember, but he said the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change, right? So oftentimes we talk to ourselves in negative ways because we want to be better, right? We want to toughen ourselves up and do it differently, but when we're talking to ourselves like jerks, that actually gets in the way of making the positive behavior change that we want to. So sometimes things that get in the way, it can feel cheesy. Guess what? It is. It is cheesy. I'm not going to make any excuses for it. It's cheesy, but it works, right? So I'm not like standing on a street corner like doing this for myself. Like I found at one point when I was having a lot of painful experiences, I would start like just massaging my hand. And then one day I was like, isn't that loving that I'm doing that to myself? And it's not like, no one knows that I'm being a weirdo and practicing self-compassion. So you can soften the cheese factor. I'm not worthy of self-compassion, right? We already talked about that a little bit, that sometimes that's a struggle to believe that we're worthy. But again, we gotta practice it in order to then feel the worthiness. And again, I'll be letting myself off the hook, right? Self-compassion is not saying that behavior is okay. It's just saying I am a person worthy of love and belonging. And I believe at least every single one of us in this room really does absolutely deserve that. So I will talk to myself the same way I talk to people I love. So this is really the invitation for you to give this gift to yourself and really shift into this space of self-compassion. So we are done early. I hope that's okay, but I'd love to hear from you before we wrap up. And well, first of all, are there any questions? We've talked about so much stuff today.
Well, with the one you just said about love, talking to people, that's my daily thing to myself. And when I pray, when I'm interacting with people, let my facial expression show love. When I'm talking to somebody, even if I'm angry, let me show love. When I'm speaking, let me speak in love.
I love that.
So that's a daily quote that I pray to myself.
That's wonderful.
Every day. Because I was always told, Sheila, it's not what you say, it's how you say it.
Yeah.
Because I'm like you, I put up a wall, and when I put up the wall, and I didn't understand the hostility that I had when I was talking to people, the aggressiveness that I did, and my facial expression showed it all. Even when I sound like that, I was not talking aggressive. Right. To me, in my mind, I'm not aggressive. Right. But around the room, everybody was like, "Oh, she's so aggressive." Yes. Everybody always thought, "You so mean, you so angry." And I'm like, "What? Where'd you get that?" I said, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that I wore it.
And how great that you were able to invite that self-reflection, right? Because I don't think we always give ourselves that time to really reflect. Because if a lot of people are saying something about you, it's probably true, right? Like if one person says it, nah. Yeah. But if it's when I was a teenager, it was always like I thought you were a bitch until I got to know you. Yes. I was doing something that was not coming off okay, and I really had to look at it. So congratulations for doing that reflection. Thank you. Anybody else?
Like this when you had up something I didn't get as a child. I had ups in the two-point household, but my dad was the one that never would say I love you or show affection. And I made it out. I had my kids, I would never let him feel like that. Yeah. So every day I try to say something different. I always tell him I love him. I'm like, you're a cool kid, and you're so happy to be your mom. I try to reaffirm, you know, let him know that he's loved every day. And I make a point to give him a hug. I think I hug too much. She's like, please.
Please stop touching me.
Yeah, so I always say, I make my kid know that they're loved and assured.
Yeah, and when he's a parent, he's going to remember that and appreciate that, right? They're not going to appreciate it now because kids are jerks, but he will appreciate it. Stuff like that. That it's like putting money in the bank, right? The payoff is going to happen later.
The first time I remember my dad saying, he goes, "That was wrong," you know. I'm like, "Dad, dude, what's the matter?" You know.
Right, right.
I know how that feels. I would.
And for him, it was probably he wasn't shown what it was like, right? Right? Yeah.
Some ways, I guess I could have my daughter practice some self-care. Like I do self-care and that type of thing, but she'll be 11 and she's getting older. And, I feel like I'm not being that cool mom anymore. She'll do her own thing, and that's cool. But how can I? Because I think sometimes when I do self-care, whether it's like a bath or reading a book or just having me time, it's like it comes off as being selfish, and I don't like that. So it's really not. But mom needs time for me. Even with my husband as well. I'm like, I just need some me time. How do I guess, show her or learn some self-care ways we can maybe do it together, or for her to do on her own, so she's kind of getting to that age.
Well, let me ask first. I know you're making sense, but let me ask some more questions about it first. So when you say that it comes off as selfish, who is telling you that it's selfish?
Both.
Both?
My husband and my daughter.
Your husband and your daughter. So I'm going to get political for a second because that's white supremacy, truthfully. Because this whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you should always be productive, is based on capitalism and white supremacy. And that message is incorrect. And so there's unlearning that we all need to do in order, like we talked about the checklist earlier, right? That being productive, caring for yourself is productive, actually. And so we have to shift that mindset. Are you on Instagram? The NAP Ministry. Follow that right now. I don't know the woman's name, but essentially she is trying to help decolonize the way that we look at self-care and recognize that self-care is not selfish. And we have been programmed to believe that that's the case, but it is not true.
I don't think I'm saying it in a bad way. Sometimes it's like personal need, like just the comments of like, mommy likes to be by herself, or I'm like, mommy's hurting, mommy's going through some stuff, and I don't want them to see it. So it's like I need time for me instead of being fake, like everything's fine.
Right.
It's not.
Right.
So that's what I think I struggle with a little bit.
Yeah.
But
So when I told you that it's white supremacy and that, do you believe that? At least in your head.
a little bit.
Okay. So go with that place, because if we're continuing to force ourselves to be productive or show up in a way that we just can't show up, that's not helping. It's not helping you, and it's not helping your family, right? If you follow the NAP ministry, I have a feeling like you'll start to learn more about what I'm talking about, and so that it will then be like, oh wait, yeah, I'm like, this is a way that I'm actually.
Is it yellow?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
We all get.
So good. It's yeah. So how can you practice things with her? First of all, I would ask her, how does she like to take care of herself? What does she really like to do? Because maybe for her, it might be, maybe she likes to dance or she likes to sing, right? It's a little bit more active. Because self-care is not necessarily bubble baths, right? Self-care can be going to therapy.
Right.
Yep, self-care can be going to the gym, or it can be not going to the gym because I actually need to rest, right? So there is no right way to practice self-care, and so asking her for feedback on that was probably the best thing to do. I also kind of want to put out here too that sometimes like the system that we're in doesn't allow for self-care in the way that we really need it, and then that's when it becomes really like structural care. And again, that's kind of part of like the way that American culture is really hurting people right now, and that's when we have to like make a choice to step outside of that and challenge our systems to do it better. I'm gonna be fighting the man. But it's a really great question. Other questions? Okay, so let's move to this then. What did you hear today, or what did you learn today that was meaningful?
Compassion for yourself.
Yeah. Anything else? What did you learn? You raising your hand? Yeah, what'd you learn? She's so cute. Nothing else? You didn't learn anything? It was stupid?
Pause.
Pause.
Take a pause for yourself.
Take a pause. Wonderful. Are you going to tattoo it as well?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
great. We'll be tattoo twins. Mm-hmm.
But like you, self-esteem, the difference between self-esteem and self-worth,
Mm-hmm.
and knowing that.
Great. Anything else?
I think that it all was helpful. I'm just glad that even with the young lady here speaking, that you all were able to kind of shed some light on me about the difference in the what can seem to be contradictory, the contradictions with kind of being sympathetic and empathetic, but more importantly with acknowledging your own hurt and pain and having compassion for yourself versus being a victim, and allowing that story to be what kind of leads you.
Yep. Great. So while we're on this, I'm going to pass out, they created a little survey here, so they want to hear how this was for you. So I'll pass out some of these if you can fill it out before you leave. I don't know who's going to take them. You will take them, thank you. And can you pass these to that over there? Thank you. So I also, here are some books if you want to take a picture of this. These are some of the books that I talked about today. Some of them I didn't talk about, but a lot of the information that I shared today is in these books. So yeah, take